Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Workplace Pride webinar entitled Corporate Advocacy for LGBT Rights, a Call to Action. So I'm very happy to be having this webinar today. And my name, by the way, is David Pollard. I'm the Executive Director of Workplace Pride. And I'm sitting together with Dr. Felicity Daly. Felicity was the author of the research study, and she's the visiting research fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies School of Advanced Study in the University of London. So welcome, Felicity, very much.
Thank you, David.
To the webinar today. So I would like to give a little bit of background about the report. The Workplace Pride, of course, as many of you know, has been working with businesses who have activities around the world, often in places where it's very difficult to have an LGBTIQ plus policy or practices. For their employees and also for the communities in which they work. A number of our members came to us with the request over time to help them determine what they can do in some of these more difficult places around the world. They wanted to be able to create a safe place for their employees, but they really didn't know how because they were, again, confronted with legislation or cultural practices that could be very, very difficult for them. And so that is actually how the idea of this paper came about. We wanted to be able to collect ideas and actual practical examples of how corporations and any type of employer for that matter can work together internally and externally to make a difference when it comes to discriminatory practices in places around the world. So that was how we got started with it. A little bit more of the situations to really make it real for the participants today is there have been situations, for example, in Uganda, in Brunei, in Hungary, where it's very, very difficult for not only an LGBTI person themselves, but also for a business to take any type of stance on the issue. And of course, we're all living through it right now, again, with the situation in the Ukraine. We're seeing our community being very marginalized. And so the question does come up, what can our community do? And what can the businesses do to help them out? About the report itself, I would like to first of all thank IBM for their support in the project. They helped give us some overall framework and guidelines and some expertise. And I'd like to thank very much the many stakeholders and participants who took part, which Felicity is going to explain in a little bit more detail in a moment. And finally, I'd like to thank Ms. Stephanie Blackwood. Stephanie is a good friend, and she helped with the copy editing of this paper. She's based in New York, so I know you're there, Stephanie, so thank you very much. And before I introduce Felicity, I'd like to mention that if you do have questions throughout the webinar, you can put your questions in the Q&A section. I believe it's on the upper right-hand corner, not in the chat, but in the Q&A. And for the last 15 or 20 minutes of the webinar, we will be taking questions from participants. So at this point, I would like to give Felicity the floor and also mention that we're going to have some other panelists whose names you see at the top. You feel free to come on if you like now, and I'll introduce the panelists in more detail later. But right now, I'd like to give the floor to Felicity. And Felicity, again, will take us through the methodology of the paper and how it all came about. Felicity.
Thank you so much, David. It's fantastic to have this opportunity to really start to share our findings with this audience. So I'll just say a bit about the methodology. This paper is very much grounded in a literature review of what corporations have been doing in their corporate social responsibility and their engagement with the wider societies that they work in. And human rights campaigning and getting involved in social inclusion and economic inclusion for marginalized groups is a role that corporates have been moving into over some time. So the paper is grounded in what the literature tells us about that, which is that increasingly corporate advocacy is directly tied to corporate actors reinterpreting their role in society. So from there, we understood the themes that we wanted to explore in a series of stakeholder interviews, and we held 14 stakeholder interviews really around this time about a year ago. So the context has changed slightly, but this is reflecting corporate practice. Importantly, of those who were already working with the new paradigm of working from home, of thinking about the impact in their workplaces of major social movements like Me Too, for gender equality, and for Black Lives Matter, for thinking about diversity and inclusion of people of color. So I think also, the well-being of workers, everyone working from home, struggling with pandemic lockdown. So I think there's some different paradigms that if we had written this 5 years ago, it might not be that up to date, but it is just a year ago. So those 14 stakeholder interviews were mostly with people who hold the position in the corporation of head of diversity and inclusion or head of government affairs, those who actually have direct experience of norming diversity and inclusion in their own organization and beginning to engage with societal stakeholders beyond the corporate campus. Some of the other stakeholders are those who've been helping with the gather the evidence base that corporations have been using, those economic cases, and also really importantly, some stakeholders from the diplomatic community. You can see in the paper several times that we indicate how important it is we've got a young
screaming child outside.
got a young, excited
the reality of Zoom
outside. So yeah, diplomatic community stakeholders who really stressed how important it's been for them to work in capitals with other diplomatic community members, but increasingly they're seeing an opportunity for private sector actors who are based in those countries to also join them in their efforts to interlocate with state representatives and think about the social landscape, to think about social and legal inclusion of LGBT plus people and other socially marginalized people. So in some of the findings I'm going to review here, those are lessons taken from those diplomats in many ways about how to have the conversation. So to go into some of the key findings, I'm going to start with the structural side of corporate life. So one of the main things that you'll find is that all relevant internal divisions of a company, particularly government affairs, if you're large enough to have that function, or external affairs, should participate in creating that values-based, cohesive, and well-supported strategy for LGBT plus inclusion, and thinking about what do we want to do to stretch ourselves to have an impact in the society beyond our corporation. Importantly, within that is the role of leaders. Some are out LGBT plus leaders, but also corporate leaders who really understand that it's their job to lead these efforts. We know how crucial an employee resource group that is for LGBT plus employees can be. They are affected directly by the social environment, and also they are often very engaged with local civil society in the country, but they are a group of volunteers. These are people who have their jobs, they have their role in an organization. They should not be lent on to lead these efforts. It should be those corporate leaders. I think a very important finding is that legal departments, your lawyers in-house, must review the parameters of the proposed advocacy measure. In the vast majority of contexts, there actually are no legal prohibitions to undertaking corporate advocacy. So your legal department should not be there to block you from the effort, but they should certainly be relied on to do due diligence about what the legal landscape is, what you could push for, and what are some of the issues you might want to stay in the background about. So I'm just going to go to some of the key findings that really help us understand those steps in a corporate advocacy process, which are to review the situation from a local perspective, decide whether the issue is a yes, let's engage in this, or no, we're not going to engage, at least not openly on the issue, and identify why you're making that decision. You should be then informing your government affairs team to really think about their advice and assistance in guiding that strategy and moving forward with any official engagement that you undertake. You have to have a cohesive approach to this. It shouldn't be someone going off and having a conversation, with a ministerial aide on the side somewhere. You really have to have all the ducks in a row. And engage your communications department to draft the message points and ensure those are aligned to your corporate values. And engage your leadership, again, on behalf of the company to meet with government officials. So I think crucially, a prerequisite to public action is to prepare to learn about LGBT+ civil society organizations, engage in dialogue with them, and learn about their advocacy goals. You may not share all their advocacy goals. You may not get involved in all the points of campaigning that they're interested in, but you should have some common ground, and you should certainly not undertake your actions without understanding what their situation is. Often behind the scenes diplomacy could be more effective than more visible actions. So you shouldn't be sort of corporately pinkwashing and coming out on something with just some communications messaging without really thinking about, could I actually have more of an impact by a quiet, one-to-one conversation with the state interlocutor. When you get the opportunity to talk to someone from a state, those conversations should be personalized and focus on specific incidents of discrimination occurring in the local context. And importantly, again, work with that diplomatic corps in the country. That's essential, particularly in times of crisis, because they're informing one another, and their value added of their insights can really help you to understand whether your efforts would be actually an added value at that time. In a crisis period, you really need to know what's the best course of action. So again, when you're having those kinds of conversations, the things you should consider are really personalizing the conversation, making it relevant, ensuring that it's understood in the context where it's happening, which is going to vary from place to place, right? Make it tangible and immediate for the local person who may be learning about these issues or hearing the kinds of terminology we use in our community, the acronyms we use, the identity labels we use. These might not be familiar. So you need to use what are sort of public examples, something with the permission of someone who's been involved, someone whose rights have been violated, or something that's been publicly available about a type of discrimination that has negatively impacted a local LGBT+ individual directly. And that's how you can get your way into the conversation without it making it a very theoretical thing or very abstract. You actually say something about someone in the community who's been marginalized, they've been discriminated against, they've had an act of violence perpetrated against them, and how could the state respond or set a legal landscape or a social policy landscape to prevent those kind of actions or seek redress and justice for those who've been violated. So help them understand within the local context what an affirmative movement would be and how that change would be in the interest of the community, of all individuals, not just LGBT people alone, everyone in the country. And I think it's very important here, and we're going to hear from our colleague Joe Miller, to explain the economic case for LGBT+ inclusion. One of the diplomats we interviewed said, we may not be happy to hear this because we've been trying to use a human rights framework for many years, but often it's the economic case, it's the business case that helps state interlocutors to understand why positive action is going to make a difference in the long run. So just to come back to a couple of the last key points here, I think it's very important to ensure that your corporate house is in order before you get involved externally. Be strategic, sustainable, and ethical in your advocacy. The ethics of this is important. We really had a couple of stakeholders talk about when the ethics are not there, when they felt that something was being picked on because it was an easy target, and that's not sustainable for all of us in the long run. And also, we heard a lot from interviewees about working in coalitions with other organizations and with experienced human rights and LGBT plus civil society organizations. Those coalitions can often be more efficient and help, build the corporate experience with this. Finally, the thing that I want to end on now is to consider the cost of not having corporate values based on equality. You know the cost in-house to your own corporation, but consider the cost of not having those corporate values mirrored in the societies where your business is managing. And again, thank you, David, for inviting me here today to share more of our paper. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Felicity. One of the things you were talking about reminded me of one of the methods we use, in storytelling, making it real for our community and making it real for the corporations that are trying to influence with practical solutions. And that's what we're going to look at right now. I'm going to ask our panelists now well, they're already up there, but I'd like to introduce them one by one. So first of all, let me introduce John Miller. And John is the partner of Brunswick Group, and he's the chair of Open for Business on the Board of Trustees. We then have Margot Slattery, who's the group head of diversity and inclusion at ISS, and actually on the advisory board of Workplace Pride as well. And last but not least, Marijn Pijnenburg, who is a global business development executive for IBM. So welcome to all of you. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. I want to start off with a question to Marijn. Marijn, so IBM, of course, was the main sponsor of this report, and Workplace Pride is very grateful for this very visible step by a corporation. Can you tell me what the motivation is for IBM, or was, as a company to engage in corporate advocacy around the world? And what do you see as the next stage of evolution for this initiative, particularly with what's happening right now in the world?
These are essential questions, really. And especially in the time we live in now, in this, well, let's call it a very dynamic world, certain values and equality is definitely under pressure. And we see that the role of companies are increasingly important. Businesses can set a standard for diversity and inclusion in the communities they operate in. At IBM, we really want to create something that changes everything. So that's part of our fabric. We are fully committed to equality, equal legislation for not just our employees and their families, but really everyone in the societies that we operate in, and have this progressive approach and really drive these values throughout our supply chain. We need to, as a global company that is active in over 170 countries, but we really feel it is our responsibility, our corporate responsibility, our corporate social responsibility. And like Felicity says, this really requires an integrated approach where it's clear what the roles of the people in your organizations are with the different departments, a clear support from your management, and not just support, but they need to stand up and speak out on certain topics in certain situations. So for us, working with our ecosystem partners is essential, such as Workplace Pride. We're working together for over 15 years on a variety of projects, really providing value, whether it's the Declaration of Amsterdam, David, or the benchmark, right? So this was really the next step. And I see that in the conversations with customers all the time. Years ago, we started with best practice sharing. Then we focused on coalitions building, such as with Open for Business, providing more research and business cases. But now it's also about what is so important is to create an infrastructure of your organization in your ecosystem with your supply chain, with your customers, with your suppliers, but also with industry organizations, platforms, chambers of commerce, that whole infrastructure that also includes governmental organizations, decision makers, UN organizations, to proactively position yourself in certain topics, around certain topics that are important to be transparent about. So we felt that this study was really helpful in engaging on this topic, in providing great examples, inspiring, and really work together. Because that's in the end, and I'm really glad that that's also made the title for this year's conference. We are stronger together, and we just need to get organized even better than we already are. So it's a pleasure working with all of you and being part of this important conversation and taking these next steps together.
Thank you very much, Maureen. A very quick question. You mentioned you felt it's our responsibility, or that of IBM's, and also in your conversations with your clients. Would you, do you feel that they feel it's also their responsibility, given the very troubled world we're living in right now?
More and more, there's this awareness that that companies need to respond now, but also in future to their actions. And it's great that companies in the past have really created this very welcoming LGBT inclusive environments, participating in prides, changed their logo into rainbow color logos in Pride Month, and so on. But this goes further. This goes really in what's happening in the world today. Yes. And for companies, it's important to actually operate in and to have their employees in an environment that is protective, safe, inclusive, equal, not just for economical reasons and to execute on your business, but also on the longer term for your organization, the people you're working with, but really society at large. And I think that's becoming more and more evident. And companies, should take their role slightly more serious. And actually, it's part of the discussions that we have around corporate sustainability. It's not just environmental, it's also on social topics.
Right. Well, I mean, we've seen it, haven't we, with the situation in Ukraine, and how companies are reacting, maybe not specifically to LGBT topics, but certainly taking the responsibility. So I think, I'd like to put a question to Margot.
So yeah, thanks so much.
Thanks, Maureen.
Thanks you, Maureen, and thanks, Margot, for joining us today. I mean, we have a whole section in this report where a number of stakeholders talked about how marriage equality campaigning has been a way for corporations to come together in those effective coalitions. And I'd really like your perspective on this, because we know how important your corporate leadership was in the marriage equality campaign in Ireland, which is the first state to pass marriage equality by public referenda. Very proud to live in Ireland now. And also as your previous role as CEO of Sodexo in Ireland, and now as global head of D&I at ISS. Given all that context and what you've seen in how you informed this paper and now having it and the guidelines it sets out, what do you feel is the biggest hurdle for corporations to take a visible step against LGBT plus discrimination and to try to have some ambitions to impact legislation and practices?
Well, it's a big question. Thanks, Felicity and David, and thank you, everybody, for inviting me to join you today. I think, when I think back particularly to 2012, 13, 14, when we were beginning really sort of moving from a civil partnership discussion right through to marriage equality, it became obvious, and I'll try to make this quick, but it became obvious pretty quickly that there wasn't a business response. And it was one of the things that I had to take some responsibility, because I was on the board of Glen. I became the co-chair as we moved into marriage equality, but I was on the board and I was probably the person who was in that business role. And so the biggest obstacle we probably had at the time was companies' fear of having this discussion, trying to say to some degree, this isn't a workplace issue, this isn't something that we need to be discussing, as a corporation. So silently and very nicely being supportive, but not willing to come out in public, and excuse the pun, but not willing to really put themselves on the line on this. So that was the biggest difficulty. And Felicity, in so many places in the paper, you really pick up, and David, you spoke to it as well. The way we came around that was to start to try to tell stories, to role model. I remember personally having to sort of have a big piece on the on one of the Sunday newspapers to kind of tell my story as a business leader, and to kind of break a bit of glass on that one, and to sort of make it a business area. And then, and I'll keep it short, but the next part of that was to go and have individual conversations with CEOs that I knew, and literally say, and if I tell you honestly, the first time we had a gathering, and I remember very clearly, there were perhaps 10 people and they were below C-suite level. And by the time we got to about early 2015, we had 150 CEOs in
Wow.
Guinness Centre down in Dublin City, and we had the Taoiseach, who's our Prime Minister there, and we didn't have enough seats for the people who were even in the room. And that happened, and this is a whole group of people who made this happen, but it was individual conversations, hi, so-and-so, this is why I think you should be involved. And, literally ringing them, are you coming? It literally was that kind of advocacy. And then getting them to understand my story, someone else's story, and then trying to maybe, for instance, if you found somebody in their organization who you knew, who was publicly out and who was perhaps campaigning, you try to bring them into the conversation. So many different methods, but I hope I've given some insight into some of the journey, but we did get there, but it wasn't without a lot of back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. But it really matters to do that. That's my belief.
Yeah, I have a question here, because I've heard this story from you before, Margot, and I love it every time. But what impresses me is that there was a real sense of urgency at the time in Ireland, because it was marriage equality and you felt like you had to do this. I'm kind of wondering, on a global scale, Margot, what would you think would create that sense of urgency for corporations working, in places where homosexuality even has the death penalty, or is incredibly difficult and is even going backwards, like Hungary or some other places? I don't know. Can you actually articulate how you think we can identify a sense of urgency in these places as well?
Well, I think it's really interesting, David, because it's kind of part of what I'm working on today as part of leading Global D&I, along with so many others who will be on this call or in our wider community. And it's in those countries the minute you land in a country and you start meeting teams, you get to understand everybody wants us to be supporting this work. So, and I know you mentioned it in the paper, Felicity, around embassy status, but there's a sort of a need almost to go further and to have advocacy with civil society, with government, other corporations. And I think a lot has to do with creating the momentum, where a lot of corporations are now sort of wanting that change. And when the corporations come together, and then maybe you're in a very, not a hostile way, but in a very collaborative way, meeting with government ministers, trying to find out and pick out, and sorry to be cruel, but you pick out the ones that are a little bit more favorable in the first place, get them to bring you, to the table. It's like any part of inclusion. And then try to make the conversation about why the organizations need to do it, etc. And I think in the moment, in the war for talent, there's very few organizations who can ignore that. And you try whatever method you can. So you find that spot to appeal to a leader, to a government minister. And I suppose lastly, I would probably say that if you look at things like the States, or you look at what's happening in Texas at the moment, or this is a real opportunity for governments and companies and organizations to either stand up and stay in a place doing business or move out from it. And we saw a couple of years ago, when PayPal and others in the US pulled out of new sites and everything like that, governors weren't long changing their minds. So I think it can have a really strong impact when you collaborate and be cohesive about it. So I'm not sure if I've answered that correctly, David. I went wandering a bit, but I hope that helps.
Absolutely. I mean, it is literally a question of putting your money where your mouth is and walking the talk, or any other cliche you can think about. This is the time to do it. Yeah.
So thank you, Margot, so much. And thank you, John, for joining us today. So, you know, was underscored really that the work that Open for Business has done, articulating the business case for LGBT plus inclusion, has been a very important tool for corporate leaders to take on and inform their in-house work and their wider work. And we also know through quite a lot of the work that Open for Business has been doing in the more recent years is that civil society is able to understand the business case and use the business case in their own advocacy. So I just wanted to ask you, in your role now in doing that kind of country level work, you're often seeing issues that civil society organizations and the LGBT plus community face when it comes to discriminatory practices. So again, with this report in hand, how would you, and what it sets out about the importance of nothing about us without us and engaging civil society, how would you advise civil society organizations to interact with businesses to realize greater cooperation and make more progress?
Thank you, Felicity, for the question, and thank you, David and Workplace Pride, also for the invitation to be part of this webinar and the opportunity to contribute to the report itself. Just by way of context, for those who might not know, Open for Business, we call ourselves a data-driven advocacy organisation, advancing the economic case for LGBT plus rights through the data. And right now we've got teams live in Poland, in Hungary. Quite recently, we've been working in Ukraine, as well as Romania and Uzbekistan. We're in the Caribbean right now. We have a program across 12 countries. We're working with UNDP to expand our Kenya program to 6 other African countries. And we're rolling out our ASEAN program this year, starting in Thailand and then Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and the Philippines. And crucially, everywhere we work, we start by partnering with the local civil society organization. So to your question, Felicity, yes, we've at this point worked with dozens of activists in dozens of countries, helping them articulate the economic case for LGBT rights. And a couple of observations that flow from that. Firstly, to many of these guys, the idea that businesses might somehow become human rights defenders can seem a bit strange in many parts of the world. If you're a human rights activist somewhere like Indonesia, you don't necessarily think that business is your friend, right? There's plenty of evidence to the contrary. So we start by getting them to understand, to recognize that businesses can and often do become advocates. And then you get them to a point where they're, activists are almost always under-resourced everywhere in the world. So they look at corporations and they see the dollar signs. And of course, that is an incredibly important contribution that corporations can make in countries. But we also try and help them think strategically about what they can ask for. But then there's the rub. Most of the time, if you're in the LGBT plus community, you're in a community organization, you're probably not going to have that much of a clear idea of actually what's possible from the world of business. What should you be asking for? What could you expect businesses to actually do? And that's the work that we did. Actually, a couple of years ago, we did a piece of work in partnership with the UN Free and Equal campaign and Outright International that we called the Channels of Influence. And I thought I'd describe it very briefly here, because for us, it's absolutely key to unlocking what practically companies can do in hostile countries, as we call them. There are 5 channels, so very quickly to run through them. There's the value chain channel. So that's supply chains, distribution networks, consumer advertising, client relationships, customer relationships. There's the financial channel, which is lending partners, financial service partners, joint venture partners. Lots of corporations have very intricate networks of joint ventures in in countries around the world. Investors, investees. There's the public policy channel, thirdly. So that's, of course, public officials, politicians at a national level, but also we found effectively at a city level too. Some of our effective work has been at a city level, regulators, etc. And sometimes quiet diplomacy is the most powerful. And Felicity, as we put it in the report, we often say to our partners that acting in the public sphere doesn't always mean acting in public. Fourthly, there's the civil society channel. And crucially here, we're talking about not just LGBT plus civil society partners for business, but how can businesses be working with all their civil society partners? You know, they all have intricate networks of relationships with NGOs on water stewardship, on waste management, on worker safety, on many different issues. How can LGBT plus inclusion be integrated into those conversations? And finally, there is the industry channel. So that's all the professional bodies, all the industry associations, the chambers of commerce, etc., that all our coalition partners are part of in each country. So what we aim to do is provide guidance on each one of these channels, set out the risks and opportunities for businesses and examples of action on each channel, so that, you know, so the activists can become fluent with what's possible. And then, of course, at the heart of this is in each one of these channels. For us, we think it's about articulating the economic case and the business case, simply that the data shows open, inclusive societies are better for business and better for economic growth. So that, in a sort of, is a round sweep of the kind of conversations that we would have with those civil society partners on the ground in those kinds of countries.
You know, there are so many touch points there with a lot of other points I'm thinking about. As a matter of fact, we created a civil society toolkit together with Open for Business and the other foundation in South Africa. And this is the other side of that coin, John, isn't it? It's really helping civil society organizations know how to reach out to the business world. And hearing what you said, John, about the channels of influence, this report about corporate advocacy and the civil society toolkit, in my mind, it brings a lot of these things together, a lot of the points that can help us all move forward when it comes to working in areas of the world, you know, where it's very, very difficult to make progress on LGBTIQ plus topics.
Yeah, I mean, I really saw this paper as sort of taking the jumping off point as the public policy channel. And also the other jumping off point was Workplace Pride's work around, oh God, why am I going to forget this key document? You had written it in 2015.
Oh,
UN standards.
Oh, the UN, yes, the UN, the global standards.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So that this was because there were the bones of what you wanted to achieve in this paper were all there, and they were open by saying, "Here's the public policy channel that's open. Go ahead and use it." But I think something like this that provided the know-how of those who've been starting to norm this, particularly, you know, the corporations like IBM, who've really, you know, set the bar and demonstrated led by doing, and getting that on the ground know-how, and then having the conversation about, you know, what are some of the ways to ensure that storytelling is key to this, and personalization is key to this as well.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. You know, with again the situation that we described at the beginning, with the very precarious situation the world is in right now, and taking what we've heard from our panelists, I'd like to ask each of them what your advice would be for how corporations can really walk the talk. I mean, we've covered it to a degree, but just in a couple of words before we move into the Q&A section of the webinar, can each of you just articulate, really even from a gut level, what do you think the corporations can do now to improve the situation for LGBTIQ plus people, their employees, as well as the communities and the places where they operate around the world?
I think this is a really, really important discussion right now, because we also have this sort of Western feel that some things have been achieved and, oh, is it all okay? And we all know that that's not the case, and there's so many other parts of the world. So I think commitment from the top, you know, CEO, senior leadership, exec, etc. And we all know that that's important, but it's actually saying it and doing it, signing up and investing in partnerships like the one we have together. and supporting other organizations. And as we all know, we're not in competition with each other. It's all for the greater good. And then I think having that ability to invest in countries and supporting particularly the country. So I think an example, from our perspective, Singapore, Hong Kong, many others, actually investing in NGOs there and putting something on the ground. And the last one I would sort of talk to is the people who are in our ERGs. They've got to feel that passion as well. So it can't be just they doing all the conversation. They've got to feel supported and invested in. So I think it's circular. And if all those are there, you've got that energy in rotation and there's a beating heart. And then we just need to keep feeding it all the time. Thanks.
It's all says leadership to me. Absolutely, Margot. Absolutely. John, what are your thoughts?
It's such an important question at the moment. It's increasingly feeling like LGBT rights is a sort of geopolitical wedge issue. And so the stakes seem to be kind of continually cranking up, actually. And one of the points I was really keen to emphasize when I was contributing to the report, talking to Felicity, is this has to be a really broad conversation within a company. Absolutely, as you were laying out, Felicity, it has to include the government affairs folks, the corporate affairs folks, the lawyers, which is, we started Open for Business with a public affairs conversation, really. And these issues, of course, have important DEI components, but actually corporate advocacy on LGBT plus rights can't just be a DEI question. Otherwise, it just won't really happen, practically speaking. And also, exactly as you were saying, Felicity, it's like it cannot be down to the ERGs either. This is not down to the LGBT plus networks. We're in a really new reality now. Companies are expected to take a really clear public stand on so many issues, and these issues particularly. And I loved it. Last year, we talked to, we had a webinar with the new US Special Envoy, Jessica Stern, and she said, there are no sidelines for business. And, we see that right now in Ukraine. Businesses are like being asked, where are you? How are you showing up? And we've seen that in recent years on climate. And I think it should be our new motto too for LGBT plus rights, no sidelines for business.
I like that. Either that or silence is not an option. Something like this. Yeah. It's time to really take that stance.
And I fully agree with Margot and John. This clear commitment. You don't have to be perfect within your organization yet, as long as you're committed to drive progress and do the right thing and learn. But it's also this accountability to your stakeholders, shareholders, customers, employees, not just now, but also in the future. Hence, I would make this statement: advocacy is the new advertisement, because this is not about showing your logo, participating in Pride. This is really what you stand for and what you're being looked at and how you're being held accountable for making the right choices. And the thing companies is many act globally, regionally, so they go much further than the local situation, local legislation, local maybe certain values, etc. Large organizations need to have this global view, this umbrella, and then make sure that they execute always in line with the local legislation and protecting their employees, but still have this global vision, this transparent commitment. And therefore, I think really the advocacy part is becoming more and more evident, because the world is not perfect. And we experience that. We see the situation worsening. Read examples just lately in Texas, for example. So yeah, a company can just stand up for their employees, for their families, and express the importance of indeed safe, protective, equal environments for everyone.
And, we've seen it, of course, with the passion and the exodus with the Ukraine situation. I would like to see some of that passion with our community as well. I think you guys as well, perhaps. All right, I cut it a little bit short here, but we have some time for questions. So
wonderful. First of all, we have a question from Matteo, and Matteo says, any specific examples of inclusion in trans people in the corporate environment? How to manage the transition in its initial stages, updating personal details, communicating with hierarchy and colleagues, etc., and reimbursing medical expenses. It's a whole Pandora's box of questions, but any kind of specific examples the panel can give, or Felicity indeed.
I think that's partly something for each organization to tackle individually, but would one of you like to, one of the panelists like to respond to that?
I'm happy to start, and everybody else can sort of chip in, but I think the very first thing is, first of all, making sure and understanding, do we have a transition policy? Because it's all well and good sort of having an aspiration, but if there isn't an actual policy, it can fall flat on its face. And that policy should then include things such as how we're going to help somebody with medical expenses, EAP, all the various stages. And then making sure that that policy includes communication, includes how we make sure that we deal with confidentiality, because whilst we all want to embrace somebody's change, we also want to make sure that we help somebody as they're ready in the journey. So I've had experience where some colleagues may not be ready to announce to everybody at one stage, and then they may at a different stage. So we really help and support that. And then bringing HR colleagues, business colleagues, operations colleagues on board. So having a clear process for that. And then a supporting process around how we redo naming and employee information, et cetera, like that. So most, I think, big organizations would be on some way around that, but not everybody. And I know certainly we're looking at it in ISS because it's not everywhere. And in my last organization, it was something we did over a period of time, but it's very important.
You know, just to link that back to the whole concept of advocacy in different places around the world, I think it's important for corporations to be aware of the differences between different countries when they're regarding culture and legislation when it comes to transgender people. For example, we did a conference in Chennai several years, well, 5 years ago, I guess it was. And we were quite surprised, pleasantly surprised to see that for the transgender community there, they were actually further along as far as cultural acceptance is concerned than lesbians and gay men were because of the cultural history of the hijabs there. So I just would really encourage, you know, organizations as they're looking at their trans policy, it's also not one size fits all by any means. You have to be aware of what's happening around the world. Yeah.
And then, David, if I just may quickly comment, we do see that the trans community is increasingly under attack in countries, legislation, even in countries that were more progressive, equal in the past.
Yeah.
This is also about protecting someone's individual freedom, where government should refrain from actually engaging in what people are doing in their homes, in their bedrooms, and with whom, but also the freedom of people to decide on their own body. And that often parents would know way better what's best for their children than governmental representatives would, for example. And therefore, I think it's so important to really stand up and protect the individual rights of people and the trans community. So indeed, besides facilitating and making sure there's medical coverage and, you know, all the internal processes, to also protect the rights of the individuals and for their own decision.
Next question is from Ian. Does the panel have any advice for smaller corporations to advance LGBT plus inclusion when they may have less diplomatic clout, let's say? How do we best support LGBT plus staff in hostile jurisdictions?
I think, interestingly, in many of the countries that we work, often what we see is that if you think about where the energy is in an economy, you know, where is, you know, it's often about kind of, you know, clusters of creative industries. It's about entrepreneurialism. It's about the startups. It's about, you know, tech clusters. And the governments are often very keen to foster this and to encourage this. You know, it's often an explicit part of an economic strategy to diversify an economy into more high value sectors, for example. So the role of small and medium sized companies in that equation is huge, actually. And so the advice that I would give, and the work that we are starting to do more and more, is to connect these small businesses to each other, to create a kind of a movement of small businesses, working with various small business organizations or hubs to do so. because, you know, if governments can see that there is, you know, that the small business sector of an economy, which is a dynamic and fast growth sector, if there is support for LGBT plus inclusion in that sector, that's a powerful message. So, you know, you can't do it alone, but you can do it collectively. And the same applies to inclusion in the workplace too, which I'm less qualified to speak about than perhaps others on this call. But what I've seen some, you know, working quite well is, you know, you might be too small as a small business to have your own LGBT plus network, but actually linking arms with other small businesses, you know, geographically, regionally, or by sector, you're not actually. And so, you know, that's another way of looking at it too.
Yeah, that makes me think also of the whole concept of LGBT chambers of commerce. There's a new one starting up in Europe, and there's a number in the United States, et cetera, that are very, very you know, far along. But these are also suppliers, and smaller organizations can group together, as you're saying, John, and work with those larger corporations who are already in this field. They are much stronger together. Did Margot or Marijn, did you want to comment about that question?
You know, small organizations can learn a lot from the bigger organizations, maybe, and have the advantage of making use of the materials that other organizations would openly share. But also, we were in Poland with Open for Business at the Polish Economic Forum with a small, medium company. And they said, we use it as an LGBT inclusion as a differentiator. We're not gay ourselves, but we want to create this environment that attracts creative talent, including LGBT. And it works with them because great progressive people want to work with this small and medium companies. So that, I think, is a great example.
Yeah, and I just add, I think everything that both John and Marjan, excuse me, losing my voice, have just said is really apt for us as well. I think things like supplier diversity is a great area for discussion because it drives from a bottom up sometimes. Our community of clients. So if you're like me and you're in a service business, our clients and our connections also drive change. And I think lastly, when we think about safety and in our businesses, and particularly some of the countries, it's bringing other countries that have been through a journey, bringing those role models in, helping leaders to understand. So there's no one way to make anything happen. It's always just a series of different sort of methodologies and trying to see what works and what sticks. And I think to John's point, you know, really looking at what's out there. And maybe the last one I just kind of pick up on there. I'm at an event this morning, actually in a client's part. And, you know, we were talking with an organization who are Chinese in the tech sector, and they're very driven by design and inclusive design because they can't ignore that. And so there's more than one way to find ways into organizations as well, I think. So it's pincer movement sometimes.
And, you know, it's I always say to organizations, both, you know, public sector as well as civil society organizations, that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. There's so much knowledge out there, so we should tap into each other. We only have a couple of minutes left, John, so I'm going to skip over a few if it's okay. But there's one question here I can just barely read that I'd like to end with. And then it says here that talk is nice, but how should a company really start to walk the talk? What would be those first tangible steps? And can you share some examples? Now, we've covered this to a degree, but I think that's a great point to end on here. I'd like to ask each of you, including Felicity, I'll end with Felicity, to say, if somebody asks you what would be the first step that a company can take to really make a difference when it comes to advocacy in places where homosexuality is either criminalized or where it's very difficult. Marijn, I'll start with you.
Thank you. Well, my recommendation is be vocal. Be visible, be vocal. And remember, you don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with your enemies. So do engage in these difficult conversations because that's where it will make a difference. Excellent.
John?
Be vocal, I love it. Be brave and link arms, you know, because you're not alone actually in this. There are a lot of people that will be asking the same questions as you're asking right now. Link arms with them, we're all stronger together.
Yeah, sometimes it seems like we've been saying this for years and years, doesn't it? But it is making a difference. It actually is. Margot, what are your thoughts?
Same as the other two chaps, and I would probably say, live the values, and it's a great way of pulling back senior execs in an organization if they're wandering away from something. Pull them back to what's the values, what are the stated missions, etc. And where, if you put that lens over, where are we with that? Maybe last thing on that is that, if you've got CEO coalitions, business groups, confederations of business, etc., punch this agenda into their agenda as well. So make it mainstream, and don't be shy of doing that, and be uncomfortable.
And thank you. And this paper, corporate advocacy, will help them do that. Help them understand the framework of how to make these steps. So I'm going to end with you, Felicity.
Yeah, I mean, the paper does give a bit of a broad brush stroke. So that kind of idea of what's a tangible first step, it has to be very context specific. So I would say if you have, a first step would be, if you haven't done a civil society informed situation analysis yet, do it now. And that would also help. We know this has become very suddenly in the last 3 weeks, a much more complex environment, and priorities will have to be set for things that affect, broad swaths of the population. So if you have to divest from Russia, you're not going to be having a conversation about doing something open and bold on any marginalized community right now. Take that time to be doing your situation analysis of, it's in an ideal landscape, where could you move next? And particularly if you're operating in one of the 72 countries that still criminalizes, really start thinking about how you can start pushing that conversation further through all the means that we've outlined and some of the key messages we mentioned in the opening today.
Excellent and very structured advice. Thank you very much. And thank you very much to all of our panelists and all the participants that have come in today. I'd like to thank Margot, John, Marijn, and my special thanks go to Felicity for being in the office here today, and for this wonderful and I think seminal report that you've authored. So thank you very much. Thank you to Bart and our technical team, to Mike. And I'd like to encourage all of you to come to Workplace Pride's International Conference on June 24th here in Amsterdam. And until then, stay strong and be brave.